As a reminder, I will ask brothers and sisters to silence your phone or maybe to switch them off so that we can hear the news, good news from Brother Marc. You are welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Kudos to all of you who braved the day to be here this morning. Looking online, there's about as many people watching online as we have here today, so we're a mixed group for sure. The Extravagant Love of Uncomfortable Worship is the very long title of my talk this morning. And so we're going to look at worship, and you can tell by the reading kind of where that might take us. But something to consider as we consider our worship, because we come here each Sunday to worship, right? And what we think of worship, is that really what worship is? In looking at the word worship in the Bible, both in the word that's it would be the Greek word in the New Testament, the Hebrew word in the Old Testament. When you look at the definitions of those words, they are things like bow down, prostrate, fall down flat, crouch, fawn. And the most unique one I found was a definition for that word that says to kiss the hand. And at first I thought, I don't know what that means exactly, but then I realized, like, you watch movies and there's a dignitary, a king or a queen, and people come up and they kiss the hand of so I guess that's a form of worship. So I don't think we do that as part of our worship. I've never seen that anyway, but are these definitions of worship what we really think of as we think of the subject of worship? A lot of it sounds like groveling, and so there's something to that, but also it's all very physical. It's all describes a bowing down or kneeling or prostrating yourself on the ground, and we know there's a lot of Bible stories that are about that. But we don't do any of those things here on Sunday mornings. I know some churches have kneelers and they kneel, but we don't do any of that sort of thing. So if that's the definition of worship, are we not worshiping when we come here together today? So the question is, what is worship really if it's not assuming these physical positions? And I think worship does have a lot to do with your posture, but I think it's more the posture of your heart than the posture of your body. And certainly, as I mentioned, there's plenty of Bible stories that talk about people bowing down and kneeling and prostrating themselves, and that is worship, not to take anything away from that, but really it's where your heart is. And so what does worship look like from a biblical standpoint besides those things? So when you think of biblical worship, and you can get some of this, you can get a lot of this actually from the reading that Brother Glenn did for us this morning. Particularly in the Old Testament, worship involves sacrifices. And that's what David did, right? We're going to get to that story in a minute, but there was praise, there's singing and playing of instruments throughout the Bible as part of worship. There's burning of incense, there's offering of prayers, there is bowing down. So it is appropriate as a sign of humility, and humility must be part of worship. And so there's other things, but these are some of the things that we see pretty commonly in Scripture when people are worshiping. And so my question for you is, and getting to kind of the point of the topic, is, are you comfortable in your worship? When you come here in the morning and you're sitting here right now, are you comfortable? Hopefully you are. It's pleasant in here. It's much warmer in here than it is outside. There's no danger here. There's no reason to be uncomfortable. And so you're probably comfortable sitting here, and this is how we do it every Sunday, so you know the routine, you know how it goes, and so we're comfortable with this process. But is that a good thing? And I think if the answer is always yes, then probably we're not doing it right, because we're going to see in a moment that sometimes worship is uncomfortable. I think true worship is uncomfortable. Humility often brings us outside of our comfort zone. When we humble ourselves before somebody, it's usually an uncomfortable experience. And so as bringing humility into worship, there should be a little bit of discomfort in that, I think. And so we have this example that we had in our reading this morning of the account when David brought the ark into the city of David. And he was so overjoyed to do this. He was so glad about doing it. It was something he longed for. And you remember the first attempt at it failed miserably. A bunch of people died because of it. And so here was his chance to make it right. And as was in the reading, there was every 6 paces they sacrificed an oxen and a fatted sheep. David danced before the Lord with all his might. He was wearing this linen ephod, which basically is just like the tunic. It's like he's not wearing very much. He's not representing himself as a king, for sure. And so David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and the sound of a trumpet. So when have we ever shouted in here as part of our worship? We certainly don't have any trumpets, but we do have a piano. And so when we see this form of worship, it's not exactly like ours, is it? David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And when David had finished offering burnt offerings and peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts. And so he offers this prayer, and we do that. We do offer prayers here as part of our worship. And that's what David did. He distributed among all the people, among the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, everyone a loaf of bread and a piece of meat and a cake of raisins. And so there was this gift that David gave to all of the people to celebrate the special day that God has blessed them to have the ark come back in their midst. And so that's an important aspect of worship as well. I don't know about you, but whenever I've read this story and I try to picture it, and I've actually seen, I think, movie clips or something where they've depicted this, and you see David and he's doing all of this whirling around and dancing, and it is uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to watch, and it's uncomfortable to think about even doing that. Imagine me coming up here this morning and I'm dancing and whirling about, shouting and all these things. You would be like, what is wrong with him? But I think that's what Michael's, his wife's, her reaction to what she saw through the window of David was, this is not a king. He's acting like a crazy person. And so she confronts him on it. And but what I want you to get out of this story is David's response, because it comes from his heart, and this is what makes it worship. And so David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me instead of your father and all his house to appoint me ruler over the people of the Lord, over Israel. Therefore, I will play music before the Lord. And I will be even more undignified than this, and will be humble in my own sight. And so that's David's motivation for all that he did. All the crazy behavior of that day was to show that, yes, he's the king, but he's not the king. God is the king. And so he's willing to humble himself. He's willing to, people look at him strangely, perhaps. Maybe they were caught up in the excitement of the moment too. Maybe they joined in, but some didn't. But you can't take away David's worship of God, that all of this was done for God's glory. And that's really what worship is. And so in this account of David bringing the ark up, we see the clear picture of what it means to worship God. Many of the elements we mentioned, the sacrificing and the things we associate with worship from our understanding of many Bible stories, are in this story, as I mentioned. David completely gave himself over to worshiping God with all of his might. And the depth of his desire to worship God on this special day allowed him to disregard his own pride and abase himself. He was okay being uncomfortable and giving all the glory to his heavenly Father. At the heart of this worship is David's love for God, not himself. And that's what we need to bring here with us this morning when we come to worship God. We need to bring a heart that really gives it all to God. David writes in Psalm 116, the first 2 verses, I love the Lord because he has heard my voice and my pleas for mercy. Because he inclined his ear to me, therefore I will call upon him as long as I live. And that was David's attitude in much of what he did, to show that God was his God, and that's all that really mattered. All the other things in his life, the mistakes he made, the great things he did for Israel, the victories he won, going from a shepherd to being the greatest king of Israel, he could lay all that aside in his worship to God because he loved God that deeply. And so I wonder, do you know what that feels like? How invested is our heart in our worship this morning? Yes, we're here in our places with our bright, shining faces, but are our hearts wholly in this moment? Do we come this morning prepared to give our all to God? Does our great love for God stand out as a true motivation in all that we do to glorify him? Love is the key to all relationships, including our relationship here this morning with God. Another example I want you to look at is found in Acts chapter 16. And this will be another familiar story to you. This is Paul and Silas when they're in Philippi. And you'll remember that when they go into the city, there's this young girl that's following them around, yelling, like the whole time they're there. She's yelling and yelling all these things about these are the men of God. But it was because of the fortune tellers, and they were making money off of this girl, and so it became a burden to Paul that he cast out this demon in this girl. And so then the people who were making money off of this were upset, so they raised this big uproar in the city, and Paul and Silas end up getting arrested. So Acts 16, let's pick up at verse 19. When the owners of the slave girl realized that their hope of making money was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to face the authorities. They brought them before the magistrates and said, "These men are Jews and are throwing our city in an uproar by advocating customs unlawful for us Romans to accept or practice." The crowd joined in the attack against Paul and Silas, and the magistrates ordered them to be stripped and beaten. After they had been severely flogged, they were thrown into prison, and the jailer was commanded to guard them carefully. Upon receiving such orders, he put them in the inner cell and fastened their feet in stocks. And so here was this situation that Paul and Silas, in their missionary journeys, going from city to city, come to Philippi, and they encounter this problem. And this is a big roadblock in their ability to spread the gospel. Now they find themselves in prison. In verse 25, about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly there was such a violent earthquake that the foundations of the prison were shaken. At once all the prison doors flew open, and everybody's chains came loose. The jailer woke up, and when he saw the prison doors open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself because he thought the prisoners had escaped. But Paul shouted, "Do not harm yourself. We are all here." And so here in this account, despite the pain and suffering that they had endured because of the beatings that they had taken, despite the fact that they're in prison and now they can't complete their mission, despite the fact that they're in shackles and it's late and it's dark in this prison, they could do what I would do and probably start complaining to each other. That girl caused all these problems. These people don't this, that, and the other. Why did the guy beat us? And we didn't do anything. What are we going to... Like, they could have complained and complained, but instead, they start to sing. And so Paul and Silas prayed and sang hymns to God in chains, demonstrating that worship is not based on circumstances, but it's based on faith in God's goodness. This was a roadblock, but they knew God was in charge of all of this. And so why not give God the glory instead of complaining about their situation? So Paul and Silas never lose sight of the mission to represent Christ in every circumstance. They stayed true to the mission. They didn't complain about their situation. They praised God because that was the mission. Even shackled and bloody and no doubt in considerable pain, they somehow found it within themselves to sing praises to God. Can you imagine what that would feel like? Have you done that before? In a situation where you can't see a way out, and you can sit there and complain and say, woe is me, have you just started singing hymns? I know I haven't. And we know that God heard them because there was an earthquake, and the prison doors were opened, and their shackles fell off, and they could have ran for the door, but they didn't. They were okay being uncomfortable in these circumstances because they knew this was for God's glory. They stayed worshiping. And the result of this is baptisms. Baptism of the very jailer who locked them up, and probably the same guy who beat them with rods. And not just him, but his whole family was baptized because of this. They could have left. They could have escaped. They could have gotten out of this terrible situation. But they were okay being uncomfortable because they knew it was for God's glory. This is extravagant love, both for God and also for this jailer who could be an enemy. They loved their enemy, and he became their brother. Do you know what that feels like? And so our final example that we're going to read is from Luke chapter 7. And this is a beautiful account that's only recorded in the Gospel of Luke. And I think, to me, it drives home the point of my exhortation this morning of what extravagant love and uncomfortable worship really looks like. Luke chapter 7, not John 7, which is where I'm at. Beginning at verse 36. Now one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, so he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at table. And a woman who had lived a sinful life in that town learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. She brought an alabaster jar of perfume, and she stood behind him at his feet, weeping. She began to wet his feet with her tears. She wiped them with her hair and kissed them and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. And Jesus answered him, Simon, I have something to say to you. Tell me, teacher, he said. 2 men owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay back, so he canceled the debts of both. Now which of them will love him more? Simon replied, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt canceled. You have judged correctly, Jesus said. Then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? I came into your house, you did not give me water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore I tell you that her sins, which are many, have been forgiven. For she loved much. But he who has been forgiven little loves little. Then Jesus said to her, your sins are forgiven. The other guests began to say among themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? And Jesus said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. So this is a powerful story. It's really, this story is what led me to this exhortation. And what drew me to it was, I've read this story many times. I've heard it read many times. But a couple of things jumped out recently as I was thinking about this story that I really hadn't considered this other perspective. And so one of those things is, we see this Pharisee Simon, it's his house, and in his thoughts that he doesn't say out loud, but Jesus knows what he's thinking, he says if Jesus is a prophet, he would know who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. And I always kind of thought this story was about his judgment against her, and part of it surely is. But what I didn't think about was, who is Simon criticizing in this question? It's not the woman after all, it's Jesus. I kind of always focused on the woman a little bit because she seems to be the central figure of the story. But what Simon is really doing is questioning Jesus' authority as a prophet. And yes, he does have a disdain for the woman, but it's really Jesus who is on his mind. And so we're going to get into this a little bit, but we're going to see some things that stuck out to me of how Jesus responded. The second thing, before we get to that, is that in this story, most of the dialogue is by Jesus. I counted the words, and so it's like in English anyway, in my version of the Bible. Jesus says 3 times more than all the other characters in this particular story combined. But what struck out to me is what Jesus does not say in this story, which is me putting myself maybe in that situation and me thinking, what would I say? And unfortunately, it wasn't what Jesus said, I have to admit. So besides doubting Jesus' credibility as a prophet, Simon does reveal that he does hold this woman in judgment. He says, for she is a sinner. And yet what Jesus does not say in response to Simon is, Simon, you too are a sinner, just like this woman. Like, how can you judge her when you've failed in the law, you've broken the entire law? That's what I would have said probably. It's like, how can you judge her when you have your own sins? And but Jesus doesn't do that. He doesn't judge Simon in the way Simon was judging in his thoughts the woman. Instead, Jesus shows incredible grace by not defending his own validity as a prophet, which he could have done, which he did do. He proved himself to be a prophet, but he could have said that to Simon, I am a prophet. Not only am I a prophet, I'm the prophet. And he could have, as he had done on the road to Emmaus, like where he recounts all the places in the Old Testament that showed what the Christ would do. And he could have told Simon all those things to prove who he was. But he didn't do that either. Instead, Jesus shows incredible grace by not defending his own validity as a prophet, but also avoids passing judgment on Simon. And I think that was important to Jesus. It was important to Jesus not to tear Simon down, but to save Simon also. And I always lost that in this story. It never occurred to me that he was working to save this man too. Instead, he directs the conversation to forgiveness, not condemnation. And we know this about Jesus, so I don't know why it struck me as such a surprise when it occurred to me. Because in John 12:47, we read, if anyone hears my words, this is Jesus speaking, if anyone hears my words and does not keep them, I do not judge him. For I did not come to judge the world, but to save the world. In John 3:17, we know 16 pretty well. John 3:17 says, for God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. His job when he was here wasn't to condemn people. It wasn't to pass judgment. It was to save people. Even people who were passing judgment on other people, he was trying to save them. Jesus was leaving room for Simon to learn and to change and to find salvation. He created a space where he didn't attack Simon and put Simon on defense. He opened up a space so Simon could learn what forgiveness really is, what grace is, what mercy is, what love is. And look, there's no doubt this woman was a sinner. Luke says it in his narration of the story. As he introduces the story, he says, this woman is a sinner, was a sinner. Simon, in his thought, says he knows this woman is a sinner. He thinks to himself, why is Jesus letting her touch him? And Jesus himself says her sins, which are many, are forgiven. Jesus acknowledges, yes, she was a sinner. So what this woman was is not a secret to anyone. And I think it's this repeated detail in this very short story that sinner, sinner, sinner on this woman is what motivated her appearance before what would have been a very unreceptive assembly here in the house of this Pharisee. It would have been hard for her to walk into this environment. Imagine her in a marketplace and everyone giving her dirty looks and whispering to themselves and pointing at her because everybody knew what a sinner she was. How much courage did it take for her to walk into this Pharisee's house? Everyone knew about her sinful life. She had no secrets, only shame. How much courage would it take for us to step foot in that house, in that situation? If we were in her shoes, how much courage would it take for you to walk into that environment? Do you know what that feels like? And yet, here she was, vulnerable, humble, emotional, and uncomfortable. Psalm 51:17 tells us that the sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. Psalm 34:18 says, the Lord is near the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. I don't think the woman knew exactly what she was walking into, but that's what she found. And so Jesus, in his response to Simon's thoughts, it's mind-boggling to me in amazement. Because he lays out this contrast. Like I said, he doesn't attack Simon, but what he does do is just state the facts. He states, here's what happened. Here's what you just saw. Simon, you gave me no water for my feet. She has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss. She has not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil. She has anointed my feet with precious ointment. And so in this contrast that Jesus lays out, what we see is, one, Simon's complete lack of effort. Not only did Simon not wash Jesus' feet, he didn't even give Jesus water so that he could wash his own feet. Not only did he give Jesus no kiss, he did not even apparently do that, that customary double cheek kissing the air thing that you sometimes see people do when they meet a diplomat from another country. They do that double cheek. He didn't even do that, evidently. And he did not anoint Jesus' head with oil. And it kind of makes you wonder, why did Simon invite him over to eat anyway? He wasn't welcome, obviously. He was just as welcome as the woman was. They were the same in Simon's mind. There was no difference between them. He didn't treat either one of them well. But notice the extravagance of her actions. She didn't just wash Jesus' feet because she had no water, and so she used tears in her hair to wash his feet. She didn't just kiss Jesus' feet once to show her humility before him and to honor him. She did not cease to kiss his feet. She continually kissed his feet from the time he came in. And she anointed Jesus' feet, not his head, his feet, with precious ointment, not just common olive oil that would have been readily available. Precious ointment, expensive ointment. And so you see her extravagance in everything she did. Her love for Jesus. She loved him very much and was forgiven very much because of it. Had Simon loved Jesus even a little, he would have received some measure of forgiveness. He witnessed right before his eyes a great example of how extravagant love and contrite worship brings forgiveness and redemption. It was played out right in front of him. He was an eyewitness to what true worship really is and what this woman did. And he was blind to it. Like Simon, we too see the extravagance of her actions toward Jesus. We look at what this woman did and we can't imagine doing the same. It's extravagant what she did. She went above and beyond. It was as extravagant as the price of the costly ointment she poured on his feet, which I would suggest to you was 500 denarii. I think that's where Jesus got the price from in his parable. I think he knew what that ointment cost. I don't know that for sure, but that's what I think. This contrite woman went as far as she could go in every aspect of expressing her heartfelt love with respect for the one who she was convinced could forgive her sins. In all her actions were genuine and unapologetic worship. For the joy who sat before her, she disregarded her own shame and became a follower. Her extravagant love and uncomfortable worship of Jesus was met with abundant forgiveness. And the same thing is right in front of us. Her faith saved her. Surely you know what that feels like. May your worship not always be comfortable. May your love always be extravagant.